Welcome back, folks, to the episode of the American Civil War with History with Tony. And we are in the second year of the Civil War, 1862. So let's kind of review what we talked about last week. Last week, we began looking at the progress of the Civil War in 1862 and saw it was a little slow, particularly in the Eastern theater. The Western theater, a little bit more active at the beginning of the year. We started out looking at photography because we hadn't mentioned that very much, but you're going to see several photographs of the Civil War. And this is really important because, number one, it is the first major war in the world that was photographed on a pretty consistent basis. But number two, it also brought the war back to the home front. Up to this point, people could read about the war, they could, get letters from the front and all, but they really didn't get an appreciation, I think, of what the war meant until they saw it. And all of a sudden, these gory pictures from Matthew Brady and some of these other photographers began showing up and in newspapers and all, and it really influenced the way people looked at war from that point. Now, Lincoln was having a hard time. Uh, Beginning of 1862, he was really kind of down. And he was down, first of all, because he couldn't find anybody to fight. It seemed like all his generals wanted to sit around and think about fighting and wanted to train the troops and wanted to organize, but nobody wanted to go out and do anything. So he actually just sent a telegram to all his head generals, Henry Halleck in the West, uh, McClellan in the East, and told him, said, just do something. I want you to do something. And then, right as he started that, he started suffering some problems. We'll see in a minute. I got ahead of myself. Uh, One of the problems with doing nothing on the part of the generals was that they were not getting very good intelligence information. We talked about how the head of the Union intelligence at the beginning of the war was Allan Pinkerton, who, of course, became very famous later in the century as the head of the world's biggest and really first detective agency. He also, of course, created what we now know as the Secret Service right at the end of the war. But he really wasn't very good at being an intelligence officer in the army. In fact, Casey, he was downright bad. You want to know the truth about it? That kind of opened my eyes. I really wasn't aware that Pinkerton was so bad until I began to reading a little bit more about the Civil War. But he really was not a good intelligence officer, and he really inflated the numbers of the enemies facing the Union generals, and that really threw them off, and it really hurt their war effort. We also looked at how Lincoln underwent a terrible personal tragedy right at the beginning of 1862. Uh, his two youngest sons, who were living with him and his wife in the White House, Willie and Tad, both got typhoid fever. Tad, the oldest one, recovered. Willie did not, and Willie ended up dying. You can only imagine. Here's Lincoln. He's fighting a civil war that he didn't want to fight. He's not having a good effort out of his generals. Everybody's down on him. Everybody's really hard. And then all of a sudden he loses a child. I really don't know how he did it. I'll be honest, folks. I've looked back at this and I try to personalize this and think, how would I have reacted? I don't know that I could have done it. And really, it's a tribute to Lincoln's uh, ability to stay focused that he was even able to lead the country after this. But he did. Uh, we also saw how U.S. Grant began to emerge. We saw how his plan to take these two critical forts of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, that kind of was at the headwaters of the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers, worked out. And it really propelled him up into the headlines. And all of a sudden, it seemed like the North had a hero. Up to this point, they'd lacked a hero. No one had really come to the forefront. And all of a sudden, we've got unconditional surrender Grant. Remember, we talked about that, how he had sent a note to the general in charge, that was the Confederate general at Fort Donelson, and said no terms. I request your unconditional surrender. And of course, the headlines caught up with that U.S. Grant. And all of a sudden, he becomes the big hero. But that leads to a lot of jealousy. There was a lot of backbiting and jealousy amongst the leaders of the Civil War in both the North and the South. And we know that Grant had a poor history in the 1850s with alcohol, and it had actually caused him to leave the Army for 8 years. And it wasn't until the Civil War that he was able to come back. And he had, by all accounts, had conquered this. He was probably what we would call today an alcoholic, but he had overcome his inability to drink, and he'd sobered up. Unfortunately, he would have a few downfalls along the way, but not much. He not nearly like his enemies would portray him as being. We finally looked at a short film about U.S. Grant, which he kind of told his life biography, one of these reenactors. So when we left off, U.S. Grant was taking his army down to attack Corinth, but standing in the way was a Confederate army comprised of Beauregard, Albert Sidney Johnston, Leonidas Polk, and Braxton Bragg. And these four Confederate generals were coming together in Tennessee at a place called Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. And this is a photograph that was taken by one of these war photographers showing the steamboats that were unloading the Union supplies and the troops at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. And again, this is kind of scenes that we had never seen before in the war. All of a sudden, we see this. I think it's also important for another reason. We're going to get into this in a few minutes. We overlooked the naval aspect of the Civil War a lot. A lot of people concentrate on Gettysburg and Shiloh and these big land battles. We overlooked the fact that the naval battles were really important in the Civil War. A lot of historians believe that it was really the naval warfare that turned the tide in the long run. I don't know that I totally understand that or agree with it, but I'm not an expert, so I'll leave that to the experts. Well, so Grant is unloading his troops at Pittsburgh Landing, and it's going to take him about a month to get everything down there and get it unloaded and for a battle to take place. In the meantime, there was a couple of other events that took place that we need to talk about. One of them occurring in northwest Arkansas, and that was the Battle of Pea Ridge, March 7th and 8th of 1862. Now, again, just like Wilson's Creek, the Battle of Pea Ridge is pretty much a forgotten battle if you're not from this area, not the area around southwest Missouri and northwest Arkansas. It's just, it's not a real big battle, and it's not one of those battles that really captures the attention of the nation when they study the Civil War. But it was a hugely critical battle, probably more critical than Wilson's Creek. I'm, being raised near Wilson's Creek, I've got an affinity for that battle. But I have to admit that the Battle of Pea Ridge was probably a much more important battle because it really decided the fate of what's called the Trans-Mississippi West. That is the area west of the Mississippi River. So let's look at what happened here. Remember, when we left off, Grant was waiting for Buell to join him at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. But down in northwest Arkansas, General Sterling Price, the head of the Missouri militia, had gone after Wilson Creek had separated from McCulloch, who was the head of the Confederate Army in southwest Missouri and northwest Arkansas. And he had gone up into Missouri and had this battle of Lexington and a couple other smaller battles. But he had finally been chased out of Missouri by General Samuel Curtis, who had assumed control of the army in Missouri. And Price had rejoined McCulloch down in northwest Arkansas at a place called Elkhorn Tavern. It was just kind of like a little crossroad. By the way, Elkhorn Tavern still stands, and I will show you a picture of that in just a moment. Well, here's the problem. Price and McCulloch, remember, these two did not get along. They didn't like each other. They argued about control of the army. Price thought he was sought to be in control because he was the head of the Missouri militia. McCulloch thought he was in control because he was head of the actual Confederate army. And so Albert Sidney Johnston, who is the head of all the Confederate army in the Western Theater, finally decides he's going to bring a little bit of cohesion to this bunch. So he sends in another general by the name of Earl Van Dorn. And Earl Van Dorn is sent to Pea Ridge to assume control of these two feuding generals. And he basically goes down there and tells them, I'm now in charge. Albert Sidney Johnston has sent me down here, and you two are now my subordinates. Now, he had a plan. And folks, and I'll be honest, it was a good plan. What he intended on doing was he was going to take this pretty large Confederate army around Elkhorn Tavern, and he was going to march it up the Old Wire Road to St. Louis. And his plan was he was going to capture St. Louis, because St. Louis was not as heavily guarded now as what it had been, because some of the forces are moving south here with Grant, and some of them had been sent east, and it wasn't unguarded, but it wasn't as heavily guarded as it had been at the beginning of the war. And so he was going to try to capture St. Louis. And if he captured St. Louis, that might have been a huge turning point in the war, because he would have controlled the Mississippi and the Ohio and rivers, as well as the Cumberland and Tennessee. He would have blocked Grant from supplies, who was down in Tennessee. It would have been a huge thing. On top of that, it probably would have propelled Missouri into the Civil War on the side of the South. So it was a good plan. There was only one problem, and that was Curtis standing in his way with the Union Army. And they would eventually get together March 7th and 8th at Pea Ridge, Arkansas. And it would take about 2 days, but they would slug it out over a 2-day battle. And finally, Curtis would win the battle. And folks, it was a huge victory for the Union, because they needed a big victory. I'll be honest, it was a pretty good size one. Even more probably important was the victory was it was a loss for the Confederacy. And here's what I mean by that. Do you remember after Bull Run how deflated the Union was, and how it was just such a disaster for the morale? It kind of proved to be that way for the Confederacy in the West, because number one, they had really not been defeated yet in any of the big battles in the West, except for Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So they had won most of the pretty good sized battles. On top of that, Van Dorn lost almost his whole command staff. This was one of the most costly battles of the Civil War in terms of losing subordinates. Four of the major high command subordinates were killed, including General McCulloch. General McCulloch was killed while he was astride his horse by a sniper. Now, I've always grew up reading about this, and I heard that Wild Bill Hickok was the sniper, and Hickok was a sniper, and he was at the Battle of Pea Ridge, but he was not the man that killed Ben McCulloch. That was another guy. Historians know who it was, and it was not Wild Bill Hickok. But he was there, and he was fighting. He was a scout on the side of the Union Army. By the way, also there on the Confederate side was Frank James, William Clark Quantrill, Bloody Bill Anderson. It would be after this battle that these guys would kind of break away and form their guerrilla warfare units that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But this is a really huge battle, folks. So here's General Samuel Curtis. He's the victor of the Union Army, and there is General Earl Van Dorn, who was the head of the Southern Army. This is Elkhorn Tavern. I'm going to guess that some of you, particularly you sitting in Springfield, the township, have probably been to Pea Ridge, and it's a battlefield much like Wilson's Creek is. They try to maintain it in terms of being putting it back in its natural state, and but it's an important battle. It's overlooked a lot. Now, there was one other event occurred while Grant was assuming getting his big army gathered together at Pittsburgh Landing, and that was the Monitor versus the Merrimac. I know that you've all heard about the Battle of the Ironclads. Well, this occurred the day after the Battle of Pea Ridge off the coast of Virginia, and it would absolutely reshape naval warfare. Naval battleships up to this point were wooden. There'd been a few experiments with ironclads. By the way, old Ironsides was not really Ironsides. It was just really heavy timbers, and the cannonball bounced off of it. And someone said, boy, that thing's got Ironsides. Then it became old Ironsides. It was actually the USS Constitution. You can see a replica of the USS Constitution sitting in, the harbor in Boston. They've got that there now. Well, anyway, the South and the North had both began experimenting with ironcladding their warships and creating new warships made out that had iron over them. The South had one called the Merrimac. It was actually an old wooden ship that they'd put iron over, and someone said it looked like a roof of a barn floating, and it actually does. I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. You'll kind of see, or not a picture, but a drawing, and it looks like a roof of a barn floating. Here's the problem with the Merrimac. It was huge, and it had a very deep draft, and by that I mean it had the draft is how much of it is in the water, and it had a draft of 22 feet, which is really a big draft, which meant it could not operate in shallow water. It was also very large, and so it really couldn't maneuver very rapidly. It also was kind of unseaworthy. It was kind of didn't float real well, I'll be honest. On the other hand, the Union's ironclad was much smaller. It was called the Monitor. And someone said it resembled a tin can on a shingle. And it kind of did, okay? It was smaller. It had a much shallower draft and was much more easily maneuverable. On top of that, it had the turret that sat on top of it, what could be turned. And it had two 11-inch guns. And so, whereas the Merrimac had to get in position to fire its guns, the Monitor, all it had to do was get there and turn the mobile turret to face its enemy. And it really made a difference. Well, these two met on the afternoon of March 8th, on March 9th. March 8th, the Merrimac had already sunk two Union warships off the coast of Virginia, which, by the way, was the worst naval outcome of any battle for the United States up until Pearl Harbor. The Monitor arrived the next day, and they got involved in the Battle of the Ironclads, the first time that two ironclad ships had fought. It turned out to be kind of a draw. Neither side was able to claim victory. The Merrimac just kind of was sitting there, and the Monitor was kind of like a small dog running around a big dog. And the Merrimac didn't know it couldn't get in position to really fire that well. They ended up hitting the pilot house, which wounded the captain, and the Merrimac ended up running aground. So as a result, it kind of was a draw. Nobody really won the battle of the ironclads. You might wonder what happened to these two ships. 2 months later, the Merrimac was purposely sunk by the Confederate Navy because they were scared it was going to be captured by General McClellan on what becomes known as the Peninsular Campaign. We'll talk about that a few weeks from now. And the Monitor had actually been sunk off the coast in a storm off the coast of Cape Hatteras. Remember, Cape Hatteras was this Outer Banks area where the first part of the Anaconda Plan had actually been put into operation. So here's kind of a drawing. This is the Merrimac. This is the Confederate ship. As you can see, it does kind of look like a roof of a barn, floating. And this was the Monitor, and it does kind of look like a tin can sitting on a shingle. I've got a little film about naval warfare that I thought you might be interested in. So let's kind of look at this here. This is one of these Civil War in 4-minute films.
We're here at Fort Foote, which is one of the Civil War era forts built to protect Washington, D.C. from the Confederate Navy. For centuries before the Civil War, naval warfare had been fought primarily in the same way. Large wooden ships, powered by sail and filled with as many cannon as they could carry, would pummel each other until one of them was too crippled to continue fighting or to escape. But in the decades before the Civil War, a number of changes really altered naval warfare forever. The first of these changes was the invention of the steam engine. Steam power changed warfare in a number of different ways. Ships that were powered by steam were more flexible in what they could do. They could move against the wind more easily, and they could supplement their sail power with steam for extra speed. This gave them the ability to maneuver in ways that traditional sail-powered warships couldn't. The second major change occurred in the realm of artillery. The Civil War was actually fought in the midst of a revolution in artillery that would eventually lead to more modern cannons seen in World War I and beyond. Military officers and engineers in the decades before the Civil War developed a number of different techniques for reinforcing the breech of a cannon to make it stronger. Cannons like the one behind me were able to fire larger charges of gunpowder and bigger projectiles farther. This dramatically increased the range of the guns that were used during the war, and was further supplemented by the development of rifling, which were grooves carved in the inside of cannon barrels that gave a projectile a spin and made the guns more accurate. New shells were also developed that exploded on impact with ships, so that a single shot could sink a wooden warship. Naval architects on both the North and the South tried to find solutions to this problem, and eventually they settled on plating ships with iron or steel armor. These ironclads, as they came to be called, came primarily in two different varieties. Casemate ironclads were basically ships that had iron plating attached to the outside, and monitor-class ironclads, which were small boats or ships that sat low to the water and featured a revolving gun turret. The first battle between ironclads was fought at Hampton Roads in March of 1862. The CSS Virginia, the Confederate ironclad, attacked blockading Union warships and easily drove them away. The next day, the Union ironclad, the USS Monitor, appeared on the scene, and the two fought to a standstill. The battle demonstrated the superiority of ironclads over wooden ships, and also their resilience to traditional naval weapons. This also changed a major axiom of naval warfare. The ship's armor, combined with the added flexibility of movement that the steam engine provided, enabled ships to more easily take on forts, whereas normally forts had been protected and had a stable platform for firing that gave them a huge advantage over ships. Now ships could steam around and continue moving so that forts were not shooting at stationary targets, and they could better withstand impacts from guns stationed at forts. This meant that Confederates had to use new weapons to supplement their harbor defenses. Torpedoes, which today we would call sea mines, were explosives that would be submerged below water and would detonate on the vulnerable hull of a Union warship. Torpedoes were also used as offensive weapons when they were attached to torpedo boats, which were vessels designed to carry the torpedoes on a spar and ram into a Union warship. For the most part, torpedo boats were not very successful, although there were a few instances of them damaging Union warships. Torpedo boats were designed low to the water so that they presented a low profile. Taking the idea one step further, Confederates developed submarines that submerged completely. The first successful submarine attack was carried out by the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley in 1864 when it sank the USS Housatonic. Confederates built other submarines as well, although none of them were particularly successful. Nevertheless, the naval technologies developed during the Civil War changed naval warfare for almost a century after the war. Only the advent of fixed-wing aircraft challenged the superiority of the submarines and battleships that had their origins in the 1860s.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about the CSS Hunley when we get to 1864 because it's an interesting story. The first really submarine attack, successful submarine attack. I knew about the Hunley and I knew about the Confederate use of submarines. I was not aware that the first submarine that was invented that worked was in the Revolutionary War. I didn't know that until I started reading. We'll talk about that when we get to it later. Well, as I've told you a couple times here, Grant and his army had unloaded at Pittsburgh Landing. And, after a few weeks, getting ready, prepared to head down to Corinth. Corinth is down here. This was a big crossroads and a huge, important depot. You can see it controlled the Tennessee River, it controlled it was kind of a crossroads of major railroads. It was a huge, important crossroads that, if secured by the Union Army, would really make a difference. So this is the target of Grant. And this ends up being the site up here at the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, as it's known in the North, but usually people refer to it as a Southern name, the Battle of Shiloh. Almost everybody calls it Shiloh. Even the Northern historians who kind of prefer to talk about the battles in the Northern name actually call it the Battle of Shiloh because it has a good ring to it, I suppose. Well, what happened at the Battle of Shiloh? Well, It occurred about a month after the Battle of Pea Ridge. And it ended up being a Union victory, as we will see, but it really did expose Grant's big flaw as a military leader because at the beginning of the battle, the Union almost lost it. And it was because Grant had not adequately prepared for his enemy possibly attacking him. Grant was so fixated on how he was going to conquer his enemy, and he was good at it, and he did it more often than not. He was sometimes ill prepared if the enemy took the battle to him first, which is exactly what happened at Shiloh, April 6, 1862. Now, Grant had established his headquarters a little bit upriver on the Tennessee River, which is totally what usually happened. Very seldom did headquarters actually end up being where the main army is. They usually had their headquarters a few miles back. That was a little bit safer. He had left the encampment of his troops under the command of General Sherman, who, of course, would become very famous in his own right. Sherman kind of made a really critical mistake here. He had no idea. His intelligence wasn't very good, because, and I'm not talking about his intelligence. I'm talking about the Army's intelligence unit had done a poor job. He was unaware that these 4 Confederate generals had already come together. He thought they were still down in Corinth, and they had actually come together and had marched upriver to Shiloh. And sure enough, on the morning of April 6th, right at daybreak, actually a little bit before daybreak, this huge Confederate army comes screaming in to the Union camp. And it's a miracle that it didn't turn out worse than what it was. Grant was upriver, and once he heard the cannon going off, he realized that there was a big battle taking place. And so the story goes, I think he had actually been thrown and he had to be helped on his horse. And he had injured his leg, and he made a quick ride to the battlefield to assume command. That probably is one reason it led to this rumor that he was drunk in his tent, because he got there late and he was kind of wobbly because he had actually been injured. But anyway, Grant gets there and he finds that it's not a good situation. Beauregard had already just, his army, one of the 4 Confederate armies, had just screamed into the Union camp and just really attacked the unsuspecting Union troops, not as badly as what some people heard. Grant, realizing that the battle was not turning out like he had expected, sent word to Buell, who was at Nashville, to hurry up and get his troops to Shiloh because there was a big battle going on. So Buell, who's already on his way, hurries up. The afternoon of the 6th, the 2 armies just fight it out. I mean, folks, it is a horrible battle. I'm going to read you a description of here in a few moments. Most of it was fought at a place called the Hornet's Nest. You'll see here in a minute why they called it the Hornet's Nest. Number one, it was kind of shaped like a hornet's nest on a map if you look at where the battle took place. But number two, they said it was called that because the bullets were just flying around and humming so loud that it sounded like a bunch of hornets attacking you. It was just a horrible battle, and the aftermath is even worse. There's a huge turning point in the war toward the end of the day. Albert Sidney Johnston, who very well may have been the best Confederate general, and this was his first really big battle in the war, was mortally wounded and bled to death within a few minutes. There's a story behind this. Johnston had already been wounded before, I believe it was during the Mexican War, and as a result, one of his legs was pretty much numb. He could walk and he could ride, but he didn't have a lot of feeling in this one leg. He was unaware that he had been shot in the leg. He was astride his horse and leading the battle. He was actually right up front leading the battle, and he was unaware that he had been shot until one of his soldiers looked, and he was wearing high-top boots and saw blood coming out over the top of his boots. And he learned that Johnston said, "Sir, you're wounded." And it said that Johnston looked down and he said, "Yes, and I'm afraid mortally." And at that point, he fell off his horse. Come to find out, that the bullet had severed his femoral artery, which is the big artery running down the leg, and he bled to death in a few minutes. He was unaware that he'd been shot because his leg was numb. Well, that's a huge loss for the Confederacy. Beauregard is now in charge of the Army because he's the next up. He's the next man up. And so Beauregard takes command of the Army, and they continue fighting. And finally, it's nighttime, and you don't see a lot of battles in the Civil War being fought at night. In fact, you almost never see any. And both sides kind of withdrew and to their lines and waited for the next day. At this point, Grant is advised by his subordinates to retreat. They say, we've been whipped, Grant. And Grant looked at him and said, retreat? No, I propose to attack at daybreak, and whipped him. Grant that's the way he was a bulldog. He absolutely refused to be defeated. Even when most generals probably would have retreated because of the losses he had sustained that day, he absolutely refused to do it. I'm sure that Beauregard thought that's exactly what was going to happen. So that night was just probably one of the most horrific nights in the Civil War. There was said to be 90,000 troops on both sides together, looking down at each other. There was, of course, a few snipers going on. There was about 10,000 wounded and dead soldiers laying on the battlefield. It was nighttime. They couldn't do anything about it. On top of that, it started raining. There was lightning going on all over the place. And they said that it was just a horrible night. I'm going to read you a description of it here in the morning. In a moment, the next morning, Grant's army it ended up, attacking Beauregard's army and driving him off the field. And again, this just plays right into the headline that comes on. Grant is he's a fighter, folks. This guy will not give up. He absolutely refuses to be defeated. And that's the reason he becomes so successful in the Civil War. It's not because he's a great strategian or tactician, which he was, but it's because he just is so persistent. He refuses to stop fighting. And that's exactly what Grant was looking for. Here's kind of a map of the battlefield. And again, I apologize for the map. I didn't like any of the maps I could find because they're all just littered with things. And so I wanted to try to draw my own maps, which kind of shows you a little bit of how things work. Here's the Tennessee River. And Grant's headquarters was up here. And Sherman and Wallace were kind of over here. And Beauregard and Johnson's group were down here. This is the Hornet's Nest. This is where the main fighting takes place on the first day. The next day, it takes place over at the little log church called the Shiloh Church, which is where the battle gets its name. So this is kind of a rough diagram of the Battle of Shiloh. Let me read you a description. This is from Ron Chernow's book, Biography of U.S. Grant, and he describes the Battle of Shiloh. And I apologize. It's a pretty gruesome description, but I think this, I think we need to understand how bad this battle and this Civil War was. On that stormy first night at Shiloh, 2,000 corpses lay strewn across a reeking battlefield that stretched for 12 square miles. In this nightmarish landscape, thousands of wounded men lay writhing and moaning in the drenching rain, their contorted figures lit by sporadic lightning. The ground was slick with blood and carpeted with torn limbs and decapitated heads. Wild pigs rooted amongst putrefying bodies, their snorts audible to the dying soldiers. Meanwhile, Union gunboats anchored in the Tennessee River showered Confederate positions with shells, adding to the unearthly cacophony. Many soldiers died of exposure that night, while the living found absolutely no shelter as they slept in puddles. This night of horrors will haunt me to my grave, swore a Confederate soldier. I know that's a horrific description, folks, but I think it really does show us what was going on in these battles. Well, as we've seen, Grant wins. He snatches victory from the jaws of defeat, literally. But it was at a huge cost, folks. The federal forces had suffered over 1,700 killed in action, 8,500 wounded, and folks, most of those died. That was a really bad thing about the Civil War. Casualty rates amongst the wounded were extremely high, mortality rates. Almost 3,000 were missing. That's a total, if you add that up, that's a total of about 13,000 soldiers missing, KIA, or wounded. The Confederate wasn't much better. 1,500 killed, 6,600 wounded, 1,000 missing. It was the deadliest battle of the Civil War up to that point. It had doubled the number of casualties of Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Fort Donelson, and Fort Henry, and Pea Ridge combined. It doubled the losses of those battles, of every battle, major battle of the Civil War up to that point. It was a horrific battle. Now, so it was a victory, but it was a victory at huge cost. Halleck arrives a couple of days later, and of course, the first thing he hears is all these disgruntled subordinates, and Grant was a hard taskmaster. Some of the people that worked under him didn't like him because he absolutely expected them to do their job. And there were some disgruntled subordinates, and they went to Halleck and they said, the reason it was so bad the first day was because Grant was drunk in his tent. And when he got there, he's wobbling all over the place. And there were soldiers bayoneted in their truck, in their tents. All of this was false. There was absolutely no truth to any of it. But Halleck listens to it. And of course, he's got this jealousy thing going on because he doesn't want Grant to take over from him. And so he suspends Grant. He actually suspends him. He demotes him to second place, second in command, but it's basically a suspension. And of course, stories begin to be leaked to the newspaper, mostly because because Halleck and Buell, who's not much better than Halleck as far as being jealous, they start leaking all these reports how Grant is unqualified to be the general. He's a butcher, And of course, the press turns on Grant again. This is the second victory he's had, big victory. And again, the press turns on him because of all these rumors going on. Lincoln is under tremendous pressure to fire him. Even some of the Republicans who had supported Lincoln and supported Grant up to this point went to him and said, "You've got to fire this guy. You cannot let this continue." And Lincoln had some people on the ground there, and they reported back, they cabled back and said, none of this is true. This is all false. He was not drunk. He did get there late, but it was because he was unaware of the buildup because Sherman had not notified him that there was a big army here. And, they said, you can't, this guy's doing his job. So Lincoln, under tremendous pressure, just basically got his cabinet together and Lincoln and the Republican leaders together and said, I cannot fire this man. He fights. And he absolutely stood his ground and stood behind Grant when just about everybody else had abandoned him. So big, important victory for Grant and the Union Army. It is the biggest battle up to that point in the Civil War, and it is a Union victory, which was sorely needed because remember, this is a bad time for the Union. They hadn't had a lot of success. And all of a sudden, they finally have found their hero, U.S. Grant. So that's it for today. We're going to stop at this point. I appreciate you being with me. I hope you've learned something. This is, I really, again, encourage you to, continue with this. Lifelong learning is so important at our age. Every day I age, I realize how much more important it is that I stay active mentally. And I encourage you to do the same. And if you don't want to listen to me, listen to somebody else. But listen to somebody. Do some reading. So I'll let it go. I appreciate it. Next week, we're going to see how the war continues in 1862. We're going to look at some more events that occur in the West. The Battle of New Orleans is captured by Farragut, and some other things take place. So we'll be looking at that next week. And then we'll turn to the east and see how things are going there, which they're not going very good, folks. it They haven't found their grant yet. So we will see you next week, hopefully. So long.
That's good.
Bye bye.
I knew there was a lot of men killed, but boy, that's just,
Okay, well, I don't know about you fine people, but I'm wanting to get some. Before the river, I mean before. A little early for me. What? A little early for me. Okay.
say August, which I'll give you a packet of information, but say you can see all of the things that are, so they say the different church. services. Oh,
So
okay.
they could just watch it in there and watch it.
And cable TV is included. But we have. So they will do things here, sometimes other communities. Or even- Well, I think we have like some kind of. Have like a garden club. A lot of different clubs here.
You might start it.
And I was gonna say. Has she, I want to say we've done stuff like that. Oh, that's when she was.
This thing uses cards.
Okay,
Is there any place that she could set something she had outside of it?
yeah. I'm sure that.
Rana, you,